They never had children, but she knew how much he dreamed of it. After his death, she went up to the attic for the first time, where he had forbidden her to go her whole life, and saw the house that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The first weeks after Richard's funeral passed in a kind of suspended quiet, the kind that seeps through the walls and settles into a person's breathing. The house, once full of ordinary noise, the creak of floorboards under his boots, the rattle of dishes after dinner, the hum of the radio he always left on, Lo had grown unnaturally still. Martha Eldon found herself moving through the rooms as though she were an uninvited guest in her own life. Every corner carried his presence, his jacket still hung by the back door, the scent of cedar faintly clinging to it. His coffee mug sat on the shelf beside hers. And upstairs, beyond the narrow hall, stood the small wooden door that led to the attic. Locked, always locked. For 27 years, Richard had kept that door closed to her. Whenever she asked, he'd smiled in his mild, quiet way, and said there was nothing worth seeing, just tools and dust and old things. She'd learned not to press. Yet now the house seemed to press back at her with that sealed silence, as if the air itself wanted her to know what lay above. Outside, autumn was drawing toward its close. Wind brushed dry leaves against the porch like whispers. Martha tried to keep busy. She cleaned the kitchen, sorted the laundry, answered the few sympathy letters that arrived from neighbors and distant cousins. But the rhythm of her days had collapsed. Meals no longer had a schedule. Sleep came in fragments. The television murmured sometimes in the background, just to make the rooms feel less hollow. And still, her eyes kept finding that narrow staircase that led upward. She would pause at the bottom step in the evenings, looking up at the door where a sliver of light cut across the frame from the hallway lamp, then turn away. She told herself there was no need to disturb the past, yet the thought returned, steady as a heartbeat. When night came, the quiet deepened. Without Richard's breathing beside her, she woke often, uncertain what hour it was. Sometimes, she thought she heard faint creaks above, as if wood shifted in its sleep. She'd pull the blanket higher and tell herself it was only the house settling. But memory had its own noises. It replayed voices, half-finished conversations, his laughter echoing down the hall years ago. Once, she dreamed she heard a child running somewhere beyond the walls, the patter light and quick, and woke with tears on her face before she understood why. The morning after one of those restless nights, she decided to start sorting Richard's things. His office smelled faintly of paper and oil from the typewriter he'd kept, though he rarely used it. The desk drawers were neat, arranged with the precision of a man who believed order could keep life from spilling into chaos. She found receipts, old blueprints, his notebooks of carpentry sketches. Beneath a stack of yellowed letters lay a small envelope without any writing on it. She turned it over and saw a bit of tarnished brass glinting through a tear in the paper. Inside was a key small, cool, heavier than it looked. A faded tag dangled from a string around its neck. The letters were barely legible, rubbed almost smooth, but she could still make out the word attic. For a long moment she just sat there, the key resting on her palm, her pulse uneven. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer. Part of her wanted to tuck the key back into the drawer, to leave things untouched. But another part, quieter and deeper, felt that this discovery was not an intrusion. It was an invitation, one left for her when he could no longer speak. She slipped the key into her sweater pocket and closed the drawer. All that day, the thought of the attic followed her. While she swept the porch, while she folded towels, even as she tried to read, the image returned. That narrow door at the end of the hall, the brass handle that had dulled under his hand, What could he have kept there so carefully? By evening, as the rain began tapping against the windows, her hesitation broke. She fetched a small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and climbed the stairs slowly, one hand tracing the wall. The wood groaned beneath her feet, not in menace, but in memory. At the top, she stood before the door. The key fit easily, as though it had been waiting for years. When she turned it, a dry click sounded, and the latch gave way. The smell that drifted out wasn't the must of neglect she expected. It was faintly sweet, like sawdust mixed with something clean, almost new. She pushed the door open and lifted the flashlight. What she saw made her breath catch. The attic was not a storage space at all. It was a room within a room, a miniature house built beneath the sloping beams. Wooden walls divided the space into shapes that mimicked the outline of a small home. A window framed with lace curtains looked out onto the dim air. Beneath it sat a toy chest, polished to a dull shine. A tiny bed stood against one wall, covered with a handmade quilt patterned in soft blues. Everything was scaled for a child, though no child had ever lived here. Martha stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight trembling slightly. The floor was swept clean. Dust lay only in the corners, as though someone had come here often enough to care. On a low shelf sat an assortment of toys, a wooden horse, a set of alphabet blocks, a small globe with faded oceans. A chair no bigger than her knees stood beside a table laid with picture books. She reached out to touch one, tracing the worn spine. It was a storybook about explorers and distant lands, one Richard had once mentioned loving as a boy. The edges were frayed, but it had been carefully mended with tape. On the wall hung a framed photograph, its glass a little cloudy. It showed a much younger Richard, smiling awkwardly, holding a hammer in his hand, beside what looked like the beginnings of this very miniature house. Behind him was only rafters and empty space. He must have built it years ago, long before she'd thought to ask what he did up here. The realization unfolded slowly in her mind. This was not a workshop or a whim. It was a nursery, a dream of one. She moved deeper into the small house. Inside a dresser, she found neatly folded shirts, tiny socks, a pair of baby shoes no larger than her palm. Each item looked unused, but kept as if they were precious relics. On the windowsill sat a small stuffed bear with a missing ear, its fur worn thin at the edges. Beneath it lay a note, written in Richard's steady hand. For those who might come after. The words blurred as she read them. Martha sank onto the little bed. It creaked softly under her weight. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden flood of emotion that had no name. She realized how little she had understood the quiet man she'd lived beside for nearly 3 decades. He had built things not only to shelter their lives, but to hold what their hearts could not. She remembered the years when they'd tried for a child, the clinic visits, the hopeful months, the disappointments that had grown gentler only through exhaustion. After the last attempt, they'd stopped speaking of it altogether. He'd turned to his work, she to her routines. Yet he had never truly stopped waiting. Here, under the roof of the house he'd built for her, he had constructed another, smaller one for the family that never came. The rain intensified, drumming softly on the shingles above. She sat there, listening, imagining him up here at night, measuring boards, sanding corners, painting the small walls by the light of a single bulb. Perhaps he'd hummed to himself. Perhaps he'd whispered names he never had a chance to use. She pressed her fingers to the quilt, realizing it was one she'd made long ago, thinking it might cover a crib someday. He must have found it in storage and brought it here. Her throat tightened. For the first time since the funeral, she wept. Not the hollow, polite tears of grief, but a deep, shuddering sorrow that carried gratitude within it. Every line of the little house, every toy, Every folded piece of cloth spoke of his longing and his tenderness. He had not meant to keep her out of cruelty. He had only wanted to preserve the fragile space where hope could still exist. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff. She turned off the flashlight and let the dim attic light fall over the miniature home one last time. It seemed to glow faintly, the pale wood reflecting the muted gold from the hallway. She closed the door gently behind her, but did not lock it. Downstairs, the house felt less empty. The silence now held a heartbeat within it. As she descended the stairs, the sound of rain eased, replaced by the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room. Martha sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped loosely around the cooling cup of tea she'd left earlier. The taste of dust and sweetness lingered in the air, the scent of wood and memory. She looked toward the ceiling and whispered softly, as though speaking to the man who had built two homes. One for the life they lived together, and one for the life they only dreamed of. "You kept it safe," she said, "all this time." Outside, the clouds began to part, revealing a thin streak of moonlight across the yard. The beam slipped through the upstairs window and faintly illuminated the hall, reaching just to the top of the attic door. Martha watched the silver glow settle there before she turned off the lamp and let the house breathe again. The night passed quietly. She slept, not deeply but peacefully, as if something gentle had unfolded within her. The next morning she would wake with the thought of returning to that small world under the roof, not out of sadness, but out of the need to understand what he had left behind, and perhaps, without yet knowing it, to prepare for something that was already beginning within her. Morning came pale and quiet, the kind of morning that carries no sound, except the faint breath of wind along the eaves. Martha awoke with the image of the attic still bright behind her eyes. For a few moments, she lay still, unsure if what she had seen the night before had been a dream or some trick of light and memory. But when she lifted her gaze toward the ceiling, the memory returned in full. The tiny house beneath the roof, the neat bedspread, the toys arranged as if waiting. She rose slowly, her body heavy with the ache of sleepless wonder. The teacup from the night before sat untouched on the kitchen table, a thin skin of cold gray liquid forming across its surface. Outside, the world was washed clean by rain. She climbed the stairs again, more steadily now, with the flashlight in one hand and her heart no longer hammering from fear, but from something that felt like reverence. The air in the attic seemed warmer in daylight. Light filtered through the small window and touched the miniature house, turning its wooden frame a honeyed gold. Dust floated lazily, and the quiet had a gentler texture, as if the space itself were breathing again after years of holding its breath. She stepped across the floor and into the small doorway. Inside, every detail revealed more of the man she thought she had fully known. The curtains were made from a piece of their old bedroom fabric, carefully hemmed. The furniture was built by hand. She could see his signature in the craftsmanship, the way he joined corners seamlessly, the way he sanded edges until they were smooth enough for a child's hand. On the wall hung a line of sketches, tiny crayon drawings of a house, a tree, and two stick figures holding something between them. She realized he must have drawn them himself, though the shaky lines made them look as though they belonged to a child. Beneath the drawings was a note written in the same careful block letters. Maybe one day. Martha sat down on the little stool by the table, her knees pressed awkwardly against the edge, but she didn't move. The air smelled faintly of varnish and lavender soap. She could almost imagine him here at night, sitting exactly where she was, his hands working quietly, the small lamp burning beside him. How many evenings had she sat below, reading or knitting, while above her he shaped this secret world? She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the simple tenderness of it. When she opened the drawer of the table, she found a stack of envelopes tied with string. Each one had been labeled in his handwriting. The first read, "If we ever have a son." The second, "If we ever have a daughter." The third, "If someone finds this when we are gone." Her fingers trembled as she loosened the knot. The paper smelled faintly of cedar. The ink faded, but still strong. The letter to the imagined son began with a carpenter's simplicity. You'll learn that a straight line is harder to draw than it looks. Patience is how you make things true. Then he wrote of the garden outside, of teaching him to build a birdhouse, of the small joys that make a life worth living. The letter to the daughter was softer still, filled with his quiet humor, his thoughts about kindness, how to recognize when someone's heart is tired, and how to mend it. The last letter was the hardest to read. It was addressed to no one in particular, only to the future itself. "If you find this place," he had written, "then you'll know I tried to keep hope alive in wood and cloth and time." By the time she finished reading, her tears had dried into salt on her cheeks. There was no bitterness in her heart, only a deep, aching gratitude. She placed the letters back carefully, smoothing the edges as if tucking them in. Then she opened the toy chest. Inside lay a folded blanket, the one she had knitted 20 years earlier, when she still believed the doctor's next visit might bring good news. The blanket was soft and worn, smelling faintly of their old home. She remembered how she'd put it away after the last failed attempt, unable to throw it out but unable to look at it either. He had found it, saved it, given it a place here. In the corner of the miniature house stood a wooden horse carved from maple. Its mane had been painted black, its eyes small dots of ink. On the underside of the base, she saw the faint curve of a letter M. The carving was unfinished, the knife mark still visible. He must have started to carve her initial, but stopped before finishing. She traced it with her thumb, feeling how smooth the wood had become under his hands. The rest of the attic revealed itself like a story told in pieces. She found old children's books, the kind bound in cloth that creaked when opened. Inside the covers, he had written dates. Each one a year they had tried to start a family. There were 5 books in total. The last one was blank, its pages untouched. On the inside cover, he had written only a single line. "For the one who never came but was always here." Martha closed her eyes. She could almost hear him, the way he used to speak in half sentences that she had to finish for him. He had been quiet, but his silence was not emptiness. It had been a form of devotion, a gentleness that she'd sometimes mistaken for distance. All these years, she'd thought he had let the dream of children go, when in truth, he had simply carried it somewhere she could not see. When she looked around again, the attic no longer seemed hidden or strange. It felt like a room of remembrance, a tender shrine built out of wood and faith. She began to tidy gently, dusting the shelf with her sleeve, folding the edges of the quilt where they had come loose. Every movement felt like an act of speaking to him. Later that afternoon, she discovered a small metal box beneath the dresser. Inside were bank slips and deposit receipts, the kind she'd seen him bring home but never thought much of. The sums were modest, saved in steady increments over many years. On each slip, he had written the same note in the corner: "For education." When she tallied them in her head, she realized how much discipline it must have taken to set aside so much without her ever noticing. She imagined him planning, waiting for a future that stubbornly refused to arrive. The thought should have broken her, but it filled her instead with fierce tenderness. He hadn't built this secret life out of despair. He'd built it out of hope, a hope so patient and quiet that it had survived disappointment itself. As evening fell, the light changed to amber. The beams slanted through the small attic window, catching the dust in soft whirls. Martha sat on the floor beside the miniature house, her back against a rafter. She stayed that way for a long time, until the daylight faded. The attic felt like a pulse above the rest of the house. Warm, steady, alive. When she finally descended, she did not close the door behind her. For years, that door had been a line she dared not cross. Now it was open, breathing like a wound that had begun to heal. Downstairs, she brewed fresh tea and sat by the window. The rain clouds were gone, replaced by a washed blue dusk. She could see the outline of the garden Richard had once tended, the bare roses, the empty soil where he had promised to plant apple trees for the children they never had. She thought about how the seasons had passed over those unfulfilled promises, how the earth had waited in silence just as he had. That night, she went to bed early, but not to escape the quiet. She turned off the lights and let the faint glow from the attic seep down the hallway. It was not frightening. It was gentle, like a lantern left burning by someone who might return. She fell asleep thinking of him up there, hands steady, eyes focused, building piece by piece, a dream he never abandoned. In her sleep, she did not dream of ghosts or sorrow. She dreamed of the sound of hammering, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. She dreamed of sunlight pouring through a small window, warming a cradle's wooden edge. She dreamed of laughter, faint and far away, but clear enough to make her smile. When she awoke before dawn, the memory of those dreams stayed with her. She lay still, one hand resting lightly over her abdomen, though she did not know why. The house around her seemed softer, the silence almost companionable. She thought of the letters upstairs, the unfinished carving, the note that spoke of keeping hope alive. Somewhere deep inside her, a small warmth had begun to grow. Not just grief, but something new, something that stirred like the faint beginning of a heartbeat. The day ahead would be ordinary. She would sweep the floor, make breakfast, and write to the cousin who had sent her condolences. Yet beneath those simple actions, something had shifted. The attic was no longer a place of secrets. It was part of her now, as much a room of her heart as of the house. And though she did not yet understand the full weight of what was changing inside her, she sensed that the story he had started building so many years ago was not finished. By the time sunlight spilled across the porch, Martha had decided she would visit the attic again in the afternoon, not to uncover more mysteries, but simply to sit within that quiet and let it teach her what it meant to keep loving someone even after they were gone. She didn't know that within a few weeks she would discover just how deep that love had reached into her body, her future, and the new life that had quietly begun to answer the dream her husband left behind. Weeks passed quietly, the kind of time that moved without clocks or calendars, measured instead by the subtle rhythms of the house itself, the sigh of wood in the cold, the slant of light through the window, the smell of rain rising from the garden. Martha had fallen into a new kind of routine. She spent her mornings downstairs tending to small chores, her afternoons in the attic, where the air had grown warmer with her presence. She no longer went there as a trespasser or mourner, but as someone visiting a living room of memory. The miniature house under the beams had ceased to be a mystery. It had become a conversation, one that spoke through touch and silence rather than words. Each time she entered, she found herself whispering greetings, as though Richard were still there somewhere between the walls. She had grown calmer. The raw grief that had followed her through the first month of widowhood softened into something almost companionable, a quiet acknowledgement that love could still exist, even when the body that carried it no longer did. But along with that peace came something new, something physical that she couldn't quite explain. Her sleep became deeper, yet she woke with unusual fatigue. Food lost its familiar taste. Her appetite turned strange, sometimes vanishing altogether, sometimes flaring in the middle of the night. There were moments when she would sit in the kitchen and feel a slow, rolling wave inside her. Not pain, exactly, but motion. She told herself it was age, exhaustion, the slow adjustment to life alone. Still, there were nights when she'd wake with her hand pressed against her stomach, as though responding to an unseen signal. It was a neighbor, Mrs. Grayson, who first remarked upon her changed appearance. They met one bright morning by the gate, when Martha was sweeping fallen leaves from the path. "You're glowing," the older woman said with a smile, tilting her head in the way of someone noticing what the other had not. "You look 10 years younger." Martha laughed it off, but later that day she caught her reflection in the hallway mirror and noticed the faint color in her cheeks, the softness around her eyes. She hadn't looked that way in years. The realization unsettled her more than it pleased her. By the end of that week, the dizziness began. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, she felt the room tilt slightly, and she had to steady herself against the wall. The air seemed thick, filled with the scent of varnish from Richard's old furniture. She sank into a chair, breathing deeply until the feeling passed. It happened again 2 days later, this time in the garden, and she decided she couldn't ignore it. The next morning, she drove to the clinic in town, the same one where she and Richard had spent so many hours in waiting rooms years ago, chasing a dream that always dissolved in sterile white light. The young doctor who examined her was gentle, professional, unaware of the history those walls held. When he returned with the results, his face bore the delicate composure of someone about to speak what might sound impossible. He told her she was pregnant. For a moment, she thought he must have misspoken. At 52, after decades of silence from her own body, such a thing was beyond imagining. She let out a short, unsteady laugh, the sound too sharp in the quiet room. "That can't be right," she said. But the doctor nodded with quiet assurance. He explained the tests, the numbers, the fragile miracle of it. She heard his voice as though through water, each word distant and echoing. When he asked if she was all right, she could only nod. Driving home, the world seemed sharper, almost too bright. The trees swayed in slow motion. The road shimmered with sunlight. She parked by the gate and sat for a long while, hands on the steering wheel, trying to understand the enormity of what had been told to her. The house looked different when she entered, lighter somehow, as though it already knew. She climbed the stairs almost without thought, drawn upward to the attic. The air was still, dust motes dancing in the slant of afternoon light. She stepped into the miniature house, her movements careful, reverent. The small bed, the quilt, the wooden horse, all waited as before, but now they seemed to hold a new kind of presence. She placed her hand on the crib rail and felt the steady beat of her pulse beneath her skin. "You knew," she whispered. "You always knew." The words came out half laugh, half sob. She sank to her knees beside the bed and let the silence close around her like a blessing. Later that evening, when the first stars appeared, she found herself exploring every corner of the attic again. Beneath a loose board near the small dresser, she discovered a folded sheet of paper she hadn't seen before. It was yellowed, but neatly tucked, as though meant to be found at the right time. In Richard's familiar script were the words, "If you ever hear laughter here, don't be afraid. It means life came back." She pressed the note to her chest, trembling. It felt as though he had written directly to this moment, to her trembling body, and the pulse of life growing quietly within her. Days turned into weeks, and Martha began to prepare in the only way she knew, by caring for what he had left behind. She opened the windows more often to let in fresh air, polished the wooden beams, mended the curtains that had faded at the edges. She began to talk aloud while she worked, as though speaking to both Richard and the tiny presence inside her. "You'll see it soon," she would murmur. "The room your father built for you." Each task, each gesture, felt like continuing a story that had paused only to draw breath. The changes in her body frightened her sometimes. She was no longer young, and the doctor had warned of risks, but her fear never outweighed the quiet certainty that this child, this impossibility, was somehow part of what he had begun. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, her hands resting on her stomach, watching the garden sway in the breeze. The roses he had planted years ago had begun to bud again after a long dormancy. Their pale petals caught the fading light, and she thought of how often he'd promised to plant apple trees once there was someone small enough to climb them. Maybe she would do that now, come spring. Inside the house, she made small changes. The old guest room on the second floor became a nursery. She carried down the little bed from the attic, its legs short but sturdy. She cleaned the dust from its rails, laid the blue quilt over it, and placed the wooden horse nearby. The act filled her with a peace she hadn't known in years. When she stood back and looked at the room, it felt like the house itself had exhaled. At night, she continued to visit the attic. Sometimes, she would light the lamp there and sit quietly, feeling the faint stirring within her, listening to the wind against the roof. It was not imagination when she thought she heard faint creaks above, softer than before, like gentle footsteps moving through memory. She never felt fear, only a calm so profound it felt like faith. Winter melted into spring, the snow on the hills receded, and the garden filled with the smell of new growth. The doctor visits became more frequent. He spoke cautiously of the miracle unfolding in her, of the need for care, of the narrow thread that connected possibility to reality. She listened, nodding, knowing that the thread he spoke of had already been woven long before, in wood and cloth and patient silence. One morning she rose early and went into the attic with a basket of folded linens. The sun streamed through the small window, touching everything with gold. She paused to look around, noticing how alive the space had become. The miniature house no longer looked like a shrine, looked like a promise kept. She placed the basket on the floor and whispered, "It's happening, Richard. It's really happening." As months went by, she found herself moving more slowly, but her steps carried an unspoken grace. Her loneliness had transformed into companionship. One memory, one heartbeat, one future. On quiet afternoons, she wrote letters to the child she carried, continuing the tradition he had begun. She told stories of the man who had built 2 houses, one for the world as it was, one for the world as it might be. She told of his kindness, his steady patience, the way he could mend a door so it no longer squeaked, but sang when opened. She ended each letter the same way. "Your father built this place so you'd never feel unwelcome." When the time drew near, the attic became her refuge. She no longer climbed the stairs every day, but when she did, she moved slowly, holding the rail, her breath careful. The air smelled of wood and rain, the scent she had come to associate with peace. She would sit on the small stool and close her eyes, feeling the quiet hum of the house around her. On the night before her due date, a storm swept across the hills. Rain drummed against the roof, thunder rumbling distantly. She lay awake, listening. Each time lightning flashed, the attic lamp above flickered through the cracks of the ceiling. It was as if the house itself were alive, beating in time with her own heart. When the storm finally passed and dawn crept in, the first cry that filled the house was soft, uncertain, like the beginning of a song. Weeks later, when she was strong enough, Martha carried the baby up to the attic. She held the child close, wrapped in the same blue quilt that had waited there for so many years. The air was filled with sunlight, the dust dancing in slow circles. She stood before the miniature house and smiled through tears. "He built this for you," she whispered. "For us." The baby stirred, making a small sound that seemed to echo through the rafters. From that day on, she never locked the attic again. Every evening she would climb the stairs, sometimes alone, sometimes with the child in her arms, and switch on the small lamp inside the miniature house. The warm glow spilled across the floorboards, reaching the edges of the roof like a quiet benediction. Downstairs, the rest of the house glowed faintly in response, as if recognizing that its heart had begun to beat once more. Years would pass, and she would tell the story to the child, the story of the man who dreamed in wood and left love behind in the shape of a house. But that would come later. For now, she stood beneath the slanted beams, the morning sun spilling through the little window, holding in her arms the living answer to all those years of silence. The air around her felt full again. She looked upward and whispered softly, "You built this for us, Richard. Now it's home." Outside, the garden stirred in the breeze. The crooked willow he had once planted bent gently toward the roof, its branches brushing the shingles like a blessing. In the attic, the light from the tiny window glowed steady and warm, a small star that never faded. And in the stillness that followed, the house itself seemed to breathe, alive, complete, and filled once more with the quiet, steadfast miracle of life, continuing where hope had once waited. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next ones. Don't forget to share this video so more people can discover it, and keep watching for more stories just like this one.